Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've got a great topic to dig into today, something I know a lot of you are really curious about, this whole idea of making that leap, to thinking in English instead of constantly translating in your head. And to help us unpack this, we've got this really insightful conversation between Lisa and John. They get into some pretty interesting strategies. So our mission today is to take all their wisdom and really boil it down to those actionable steps you can start using like right away.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's so relatable about Lisa and John's back and forth is that they're talking about something that I think just about every language learner struggles with at some point. You can have all the vocabulary and grammar down pat, but it's that mental hurdle, that feeling of being stuck in translation mode that can be so frustrating. It's like having a Ferrari, but only driving it in first gear.
Okay, so John really lays it out there at the start, right? I mean, he just wants his brain to think in English. He's tired of that constant back and forth, and I bet a lot of you out there are nodding your heads right now. So what is it about our brains that make this such a challenge?
Well, you've got to remember that your brain is wired to process information in your native language, right? Those neural pathways for your first language are like superhighways. They're well established, they're efficient. So when you're learning English, your brain's default is to take that new input and route it through those existing pathways. It's the path of least resistance. But to truly think in English, you need to build new pathways, ones that directly link English words and concepts without needing that translation detour.
So when Lisa suggests something as simple as, oh, just describing what you're doing in your head in English, like I'm making coffee or I going for a walk, how does something so basic actually start to create those new pathways?
Because you're tying the English words to a real-time experience. You're engaging multiple senses, right? You're not just seeing the words in your head, but you're feeling the action, you're smelling the coffee, you're experiencing the world around you, and you're labeling it in English. So those connections become much stronger, more vivid.
So it's about creating a direct link,
Mhm.
cutting out the middleman. Okay, and then Lisa talks about this really interesting technique, putting sticky notes with the English names on everything in your house. So now we're bringing in that visual element, right? How does that boost the process?
Well, think about it. Every time you see that object, your brain is being reminded of the English word. You're not even consciously translating anymore because that visual cue is right there.
Yeah.
So you're constantly reinforcing those connections and it starts to become more automatic. It's like immersing yourself in an English-speaking environment, even if it's just within your own four walls.
Right. Okay, so let's say you're trying to have that internal monologue in English and you hit a wall, you can't think of the word. Lisa's advice is to try and explain the concept in simpler English. She uses the example of cupboard. Instead of getting stuck, you just say, the place where I keep the dishes. How does that kind of workaround actually help?
Because you're forcing your brain to stay in English mode, you're not allowing it to switch back to that comfortable first language. And in doing so, you're actually exercising your English muscles. You're
Mm.
becoming more flexible with the language, you're finding new ways to express yourself, and you're reinforcing the vocabulary you do have.
I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the whole idea of immersion, watching movies, listening to podcasts, reading books in English. But, as John points out, sometimes you're doing all that and you're still translating in your head. So what's the difference between just being exposed to English and actually training your brain to think in it?
Well, passive immersion is it's like going to the gym and just watching other people work out. You might pick up a few things by observing, but you're not really engaging your own muscles. To really train your brain to think in English, you need to be actively involved. You need to interact with the language. You need to push yourself beyond just listening or reading.
So this is where techniques like shadowing come in. Lisa talks about this repeating phrases you hear in English. So
Yeah.
it's almost like mimicking, right? But what's going on in the brain when you do that?
It's a fantastic way to develop that natural flow of English. When you shadow, you're not just listening to the sounds, but you're actively trying to reproduce them, the
Yes.
rhythm, the intonation, everything. And that helps to internalize the patterns of the language. It becomes more ingrained in your brain and your speech.
Another technique that Lisa suggests is thinking in English before you go to sleep, reflecting on your day or planning for the next one. How does that kind of quiet, almost unconscious practice work?
Well, when you're drifting off to sleep, your brain is in this relaxed state. It's more open to suggestion. So, by consciously choosing to think in English at that time, you're kind of planting those seeds, those English thought patterns. And as you sleep, your brain continues to process information. It's like those thoughts are marinating overnight.
Now, John brings up something that I'm sure resonates with a lot of learners, that feeling of getting stuck, not knowing the right word, and feeling like you're hitting a wall. Lisa's response is so important. It's okay to pause, to rephrase, to stumble a bit. Why is embracing that imperfection so crucial?
Because if you're constantly afraid of making mistakes, if you're striving for perfection in your head, you're more likely to give up and just revert back to your first language, right? It's about giving yourself permission to be a work in progress, to just keep that English flowing, even if it's not grammatically perfect or you're not using the most sophisticated vocabulary.
And finally, Lisa stresses the importance of actually speaking English with other people as much as you can, finding language partners, joining conversation groups. How does putting yourself out there solidify all that internal work you've been doing?
Speaking is where the rubber meets the road, right? You can practice all you want in your head, but when you're in a live conversation, you have to think on your feet, you have to retrieve those words and grammar rules in real time. And it's in those moments that you really start to build fluency and confidence. It's like learning to swim. You can practice your strokes on dry land, but until you get in the water, you're not really going to make progress.
All right, so to recap some of those really powerful strategies we've unpacked from Lisa and John, talking to yourself in English, labeling things around your home, finding ways to explain concepts when you don't know the exact word, immersing yourself in English media, but also actively engaging with it, trying that shadowing technique, practicing thinking in English before you drift off to sleep, giving yourself a break, and not being afraid to make mistakes. And then, of course, speaking English with others as much as possible.
I think what makes these tips so effective is that they're all about creating a consistent feedback loop. The more you use these strategies, the more you reinforce those new pathways in your brain, and the easier it becomes to actually think in English. It's like anything else. The more you practice, the more natural and automatic it becomes.
This has been a fascinating deep dive, and I hope you're walking away with some really practical tools you can start experimenting with today. So for our final thought, I want to encourage you to just pick one of these techniques. Maybe it's the self-narration while you're cooking dinner or putting a few English labels on things in your living room and really commit to it for the next week. See if you can notice those moments where your brain is automatically going to English, even just for a split second, because those little moments are actually huge wins. They're proof that you're starting to rewire those neural connections. It's an amazing journey, so keep paying attention to that internal landscape and see what starts to change.
It's about those small steps, those little shifts that build over time. Consistency is key.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for today. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you then.